Mr. G here. In this first episode on Colonial Foundations, we are going to use the Pilgrims and their decision to come to America as our backdrop to tackle a few important questions. What does it really mean to be religiously free? Is that strictly a legal determination, a legal judgment that government defines? Or is religious freedom a personal judgment that people define individually based on how they are called to practice their beliefs? Do I have religious freedom just because the government tells me I do, when I might know in my heart that I cannot practice my religion in the way I see fit? The government tells me I have it, so I guess I have it. I'm not going to claim that my assessment in this video of why the Pilgrims came to America is the correct one for all of us to agree upon, although I think it is. But that's not the point. The point is that we should consider evidence on our own and not blindly accept what we are told to believe about a topic. In the end, we may decide that what we were told to blindly accept was true. Maybe not. We need to look beyond simple single-point causality to explain historical events, or to explain things that are happening right now, today, in our own country and in the world. In our society now, we are force-fed the most simplistic explanations of things by the media and by politicians, as if everything that happens in the world has only one cause and one trigger, one explanation. And if we don't believe the explanation they give us, if we question it in any way, then we are deniers of some kind. But you and I know from our personal lives that there is almost never a simple explanation for someone's actions. So whether you agree with me or not in this video is not the point. I'm just trying to look at the Pilgrims' journey to America from another angle, one that perhaps is not quite as accepted. We can't raise students who just blindly accept what they are told to think, even if, as a teacher, I might know that what I am telling them to accept is correct. Learning history is important for many reasons, but if students were to forget all the details that they have been taught in history class, the names and dates and such, if they were to grow up and forget all those things, but they have learned to question and to be skeptical and seek answers for themselves, then their lives will be immeasurably better for that. It is quite evident, if you're paying any attention at all, for some reason there is a clear push in certain segments of our society to tear down the established beliefs about the founding of this country. I am not a political commentator, so I am not going to wax on about why this is happening, but it is happening. It has become very fashionable to denigrate our history, especially those things that we have always cherished. And it's coming from Hollywood, from the news media, and from the people that we elect.
We're not going to make America great again. It was never that great.
One of those established beliefs that is being reinvented is why the Pilgrims came to America. The internet will tell you that the Pilgrims did not come to America for religious freedom. In fact, most of the articles you will find on the subject will scoff at you for even thinking it. The people writing the articles will outright make fun of you for being so ignorant. And they will say it with such authority that it will make you feel dumb for even asking. Their reasoning for making such a definitive claim is simply because at the time that the Pilgrims came to America, they were not personally being religiously persecuted at that particular moment. Now, maybe it's just me, but when I see that there is a kind of cultish agreement about a topic, and everyone who asserts it acts as if there could not possibly be any other way to look at it, that tells me that there is probably another way to look at it. A little word of advice: in your life, as soon as somebody makes some declarative statement to you with a snide authoritativeness, as if you are some kind of a simpleton for even considering something other than what they say, that is exactly the moment when you should consider something other than what they say. Take it for what it's worth. That's just what I have found in my own life. That the people who most claim to know the truth are often the ones who know the least. It's not always the case, but it's pretty often. And I know this because I've been alive for longer than a week, and I know that there are very few things in life that are black and white. Almost everything has nuance. So when someone proposes something as being that black and white, I immediately go into skepticism mode, and I start digging into the facts to see if they are actually as right as they believe they are. But why? Why would somebody care whether the early colonists came here to seek religious freedom or not? Why does it matter? Why does that affect our understanding of our country? Well, because those colonists are the people who began laying the foundations of the United States. And whatever we understand today as their motivation, and what we teach our children about their motivation, builds the mythos of the founding of this country. Mythos meaning the narrative, the story of our country. And teaching that they came here for noble, affirming reasons like religious freedom elevates that story, that mythos of America, that of the exceptionalism of the founding of the United States, and that its foundations are strong and admirable. Now, before you can have a productive discussion about anything with anyone, both parties must know and agree on what is known in data analysis as operational definitions. And to make it real simple, that just means that you operate from the same basic understandings. If you do not, then there is no chance that you accomplish anything of value in your discussion. So, in our case today, we need to first define what we mean by religious freedom, so we'll know it if we see it. We cannot use the legal definition of religious freedom because there was no such thing as legal religious freedom at the time that the Pilgrims sailed to the New World, so they would not be operating under that understanding of it. We also cannot use a 21st century American definition of religious freedom because things like individual rights were not a thing that existed back then either. We're going to have to use a more personal definition, one that someone in the 1600s would be working from when they debated with each other if they were religiously free. So, a Pilgrim's definition of having religious freedom would be something like this: the freedom to believe, worship, and witness your beliefs as you see fit, without direct interference from government or from indirect interference from the culture or society. That last part meaning, for example, if the culture they are in prevents them from spreading the word of God to others, that would be seen by them as a restriction on their ability to practice their religion freely in the way that they see fit. This is how the Pilgrims would have understood if they had religious freedom. You cannot study the actions of people in the past without considering the context of the times that they lived in. So, the Pilgrims, who were called separatists at the time, and I'm going to end up using those two names interchangeably, separatists and Pilgrims, during this whole video, so be on your toes. The Pilgrims were harshly persecuted for their religious views in England by the brutal King James I. Those state-sanctioned persecutions included things like imprisonment, confiscation of their property, and execution. That's pretty bad persecution, I'd say, right? I mean, it's death and all. And religious persecution was the norm at that time, not the exception. We have to remember what was going on in Europe. Ever since Martin Luther's act of defiance against the Catholic Church, there had been practically non-stop religious persecution in all of Europe, and non-stop war between people of different religions. And it wasn't just Catholics and Protestants killing each other. It was Protestants killing Protestants as well. So here's how the religious persecution story goes for the separatists, the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims, and all Puritans, were supremely devout Christians, a kind of devoutness that most of us today would find hard to match. And they are living in England, where by law everyone must belong to the Anglican Church, or what was also known as the Church of England. Now, those crazy separatists, they think a little bit differently about the approved state religion than King James wants them to believe. And basically their disagreements come down to differences about how the Anglican Church should be organized and the practices used in worship, not any major theological differences. Remember, they are all part of the same religion, worshiping the same God, adhering to the same Bible, etc. But the separatists don't wish to practice the religion in the way that the king demands everyone in England do so. So they set up their own congregation, and they decide to practice the state-sanctioned religion in a slightly different way. Silly pilgrims. This is not allowed. And remember what state-sanctioned means. That means it was the law. The religion you must practice and how you must practice it is mandated by law. The persecutions that befell you if you did not were also the law. After continual persecution by the king, the separatists decide to escape from England. And I use that word escape because it was also against the law for them to leave. So the Pilgrims getting out of England was really not that different from things that we know about that have happened in our more modern times. It's not that different from people trying to escape East Berlin after World War II, or people today currently trying to leave North Korea. These were people who had to put themselves in great danger just in order to be able to have something that we all practice on such a regular basis that we don't even realize we're doing it. You and I exercise individual freedom tens of thousands of times a day, and these people had to escape in the middle of the night because they weren't allowed to leave. It took them 2 tries. The first time they tried to escape, the captain of the ship they had hired turned them in, and they all went to prison. The second time, the king's men show up as they're loading the ship, and the captain just takes off. He's just a hired hand. He's not one of the separatists. They hired him to sail the ship. He doesn't want to get captured. So when the soldiers show up, only the men are actually on the ship, because they are the ones loading it with all the pilgrims' belongings and supplies. The women and children and elderly who are on the shore have to scatter around the countryside to avoid being captured by the king's men. Many of them are captured and imprisoned. And it is almost 2 years before all of those who were left behind were able to come join their families in Holland. These are the kinds of things that people went through back then to practice a tiny sliver of what you and I do all day, every day, for our entire lives. But I digress. So the separatists, the Pilgrims, they're in Holland now, in the Netherlands. Specifically, they set up their congregation in the city of Leiden. Back then, they spelled it with a Y. Today, the city of Leiden is spelled with an I. And things are objectively much better than they were in England. They are allowed to worship any religion in any way they please. But are they completely religious free now? Is that enough to prove that they did not come to America for religious freedom? Because they were living in a place where they could practice any religion they wanted? Well, in the 12 years that they are in Leiden, King James is constantly sending people into Holland to get them. One of their leaders, William Brewster, has to go into hiding multiple times to avoid being captured by agents of the King of England. Their printing press is confiscated because they are using it to print materials that support their own beliefs. So they are not out of reach of the persecution of England yet. Also, the separatists are not allowed to hold public office in the Netherlands simply because of their religious beliefs. And it was also against the law for them to practice their religion in public. So let me get this straight. Believe what you want, pilgrims, but just don't let us see you doing it. Don't spread what you believe to others. and you cannot participate in the society in which you live in the form of public service. Oh, and also, you might have to run and hide every now and then. Do you think the Pilgrims saw that as being religiously free? Would you see that as being religiously free? We absolutely cannot look at events in history like the Pilgrims coming to America without looking at them within the broader context of what was going on during the time. Any honest interpretation of history must consider context. Anytime you study history, you must consider context, and it doesn't matter whether that history was 400 years ago or 4 days ago. The prospect of you being religiously persecuted at that time was always present, no matter where you were. You could never be sure that you had religious freedom. And this was especially true for people who, like the separatists, were not willing to bend on their beliefs. I mean, if you're willing to roll over, then you can be religiously free just about anywhere, but not people like the Pilgrims. At any point, your king or queen could decide that you have to die because you held a particular religious view. The government where you lived could decide any day that you are not allowed to practice your religion anymore. At any moment, you could be deemed to have committed treason because you dared express a religious view that went against the accepted view of the state. This is the normal way of life in Europe at that time. Even in the so-called promised land of religious freedom, the Netherlands, where the separatists were living when they decided to come to America, there was a deep religious clash happening precisely during the time that the separatists lived there. Without going into an unnecessarily deep discussion of Protestant doctrine, this conflict was between Calvinists. To keep it simple, it was between a strict form of Calvinism and an even more strict form of Calvinism, ending with the harsh religious persecution of the losing belief system and the imprisonment and beheading of their leaders. Beheading. I don't want to gloss over that. The beheading of the leader of the opposing religious group.
With their heads!
And those events, the beheadings and such, happen in the year 1619, just 1 year before the Pilgrims get the heck out of Dodge and come to America. Do you think that this religious persecution happening right in front of their eyes, this religious persecution of another sect of Protestantism, right in the very city that they're living in, didn't factor at all into the Pilgrims' decision to leave? As they say, if you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. If that could happen to citizens who were members of the de facto state religion, then it could certainly happen to the Pilgrims, who were immigrants who disagreed on many levels with the de facto state religion. And that very possibility of that happening inherently puts restrictions on how the Pilgrims were able to practice their religious beliefs. Were those restrictions forced upon them by government law? No. But if you cannot practice your religion in the way that you see fit, in how your conscience tells you to practice your beliefs, if you can't do that out of fear of some form of reprisal, then you do not have religious freedom. That is literally the definition of what it means to be unfree. If you cannot act in a certain way because you are afraid of being attacked, then you are not free. Their life existed for one reason and one reason only: to serve God. And they would have seen anything that got in the way of that as a restriction on their religious freedom, a restriction on their freedom to practice their religion in the way they see fit, not in the way you see fit. So again, to claim that the Pilgrims did not come to America for religious freedom, using as your evidence that they were not actively being persecuted at that moment, is a lazy reading of history. Okay, this is getting long, so we are going to wrap this up. There is much more evidence than what I have already presented here to show that in the minds of the Pilgrims, they were not free to practice their religion in the way their hearts led them to when they decided to leave the Netherlands and come to the New World. And I didn't even mention the fact that the 12-year truce between the Netherlands and Spain was going to expire a year after they fled to America. The ending of that truce could have meant insanely harsh religious persecution on them by the Spanish. I didn't get into the way the Pilgrims viewed their duty as Christians. We have to consider that, which was to convert people to serving Christ and to establish a new Jerusalem, a godly commonwealth, God's kingdom here on earth. That's what it meant to them to practice their religion. They were clearly not going to be able to do that while in Europe. So to practice their religion the way they saw fit, without fear, without restrictions, without compromise, they were going to have to come to America. The truth that we can extract from the story of the Pilgrims is that there is more to being free than just the rules which are placed or not placed upon us. We know when we are free. It's something we just feel deep down inside. We don't have to be told it. We don't need proof. We instinctively know, regardless of what the government tells us. We decide in our own hearts whether we are free in a certain situation or not. And that's a human thing. It's not attached to time or culture. The Pilgrims would have decided whether they had religious freedom in that same way. We can sit here now, 400 years later, and say, in Holland, no one prevented them from worshiping any way they wanted. Therefore, the Pilgrims were religiously free and obviously left to come to America for a different reason. It's not an illegitimate interpretation to make, but it is an incomplete one. It's impersonal and strictly intellectual, and it does not take into account what the Pilgrims saw as their higher calling, their duty, to advance the gospel of the kingdom of Christ. So the question is not, do we think the Pilgrims had religious freedom when they came to America? The question we should be asking is, did the Pilgrims think they had religious freedom? The freedom to follow that calling. Remember, to study history in context means to put yourself in their place and time, to see things from their point of view, not yours. The Pilgrims had it pretty good in Leiden. There's no doubt about that. Better there than anywhere else in Europe. But if you think that having enough to eat and having a job and not being actively persecuted was enough for them, then I don't think you've met very many devout religious people. To devout religious people, like the Pilgrims, things of this earth are secondary. They are only a means to another end. The very fact that the Pilgrims left Leiden at all for a scary, unfamiliar, savage existence in America, putting themselves and their posterity at extreme risk and uncertainty, shows us exactly how much they didn't feel like they were free in Leiden to follow their calling. So they left that goodly and pleasant city which had been their resting place near 12 years. But they knew they were pilgrims, and looked not much on those things, but lift up their eyes to the heavens, their dearest country, and quieted their spirits.